Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
Hello to anyone who's listening to this asynchronously on the Temple Beth Am podcast series. We are at the beginning of what will continue to be a long and sort of complicated Rashi. I want to set it up to give us some momentum going in. We're on chapter 12, verse 6. And I'm going to read the verse and then kind of remind you of the metaphor that Rashi is about to play with, and it's a striking metaphor. And let's just lean into it and read it generously, which does not mean you have to agree with this interpretation of the verse, but it only makes sense to study Rashi for trying to actually understand what he might have meant in his comment, in his commentary. Okay, the verse is, "V'haya lachem lemishmeret," this ritual, or maybe this seh, will be for you, and we're not going to relitigate, but something that is watched, something that is examined. That's how Rashi reads it, but it's from the root shomer, to be guarded. Ad arba asar yom lachodesh hazeh, until the 14th day of this month, because they've been asked to take it by the 10th day. V'shachatu oto kol kahal adat Yisrael, and the entirety, that's the call of the congregation of the grouping of Israel, shall slaughter it, bein ha'arbayim, between the evenings. And we discussed that too in the Pshat. Rashi will get to it. No one really has any idea what it means, and what it meant biblically may not be what it means halachically, colloquially now, right? As we said, bein ha'arbayim now means dusk, but Rashi's not going to read it that way, right? Okay. Rashi starts talking about why on the first Pesach was there an obligation to acquire the animal on the 10th day, even though the slaughtering wasn't until the 14th day. And I think his real question is not why did it have to be required early, but it's subtly different. Why was it set up so that they were required to monitor and check and do this extra, almost like glot kosherizing of this animal? Whereas in every successive Pesach, including all the years that the Mishkan and the temple stood, you didn't start having to do this until the 14th day. That's his question. And he starts by beginning this quote from the book of Ezekiel, which we started looking at last week. I'm going to put it back onto the screen. Because that's how we ended last time. Okay. And Ezekiel's language is very stark and very gendered. Okay. So Ezekiel is imagining God in one of the metaphorical run-throughs of how God spared us, plucked us, saved us, matured us, and then wed us, right? There might be some aspect of that trajectory that might make our modern sensibilities uncomfortable, right? You don't wed the very one that you raised, but that's the way God imagines God's relationship to Israel, at least in Ezekiel's eyes, right? So we read this last week that I let you grow like the plants of the field. You continue to grow up until you attained womanhood, till your breast became firm and your hair sprouted, metaphorically, but you were still naked and bare. And then in our verse, the first verse that he's quoting, Va'evor alayach, I passed by you, I, God, passed by you, Israel, in your young maidenhood. Va'erech, I saw you. V'hinei itech etodim, and behold, itech, your time, ha'et shalach, was the time of belovedness, the time of, how's it translated here? For love, okay, like Dodi Li. Va'efros kanafi alayach, I spread my wing over you, although it's translated here as my robes, maybe the corner of my divine garment. Ba'achaseh ervatech, I covered your nakedness. So it's interesting imagery. I both spared you from nakedness and intimacy so that I, God, could have my own experience of your nakedness and your intimacy, which I guess is on some level what all monogamy means. Ve'eshav alach, and I made the promise to you. Va'avo vivrit otach, I will come into a covenant with you. Nu'manai, says God Adonai. Vatihili, and you became mine. Okay, that's the verse that he's dealing with. So go back into the Rashi. We are, 30 words into the Rashi, and he's just quoted the verse. That's where we ended. Harehu Omer, ve'avor alach ve'erech hinech itech dodim. And remember, the thing I asked you to think about is, in what way is everything we're about to read an answer to his question? Because it's not obvious. It's gonna take such a long time to understand his answer. We're gonna forget what question he was asking. The question he's asking is, why are we obligated, or were they obligated on Exodus night to watch the animal for 4 days? Okay, so we're at the word higia. Marshall, do you want to read higia halfway through the Rashi? Take a microphone, Marshall. That's okay. Let's take that one off the stand also. We have to pass it around.
We're still on Vayalachem.
Yeah, halfway through that comment, he's quoted from the book of Ezekiel, and then there's a word higia shvua.
Okay.
Hold on one second. Everyone find it? Read. I'll start reading the Rashi from Hayalach. Zel lashon bikur. You with me? Shetaun bikur mimum arba yamim korem shrita umipnei ma hikdim likichato leshechitato arba yamim. Why did he make it earlier? Ma shalot tziva came bepesach hadorot, that which God did not obligate in the Pesach for generations. Haya Rabbi Matya ben Charash Omer. This rabbi said, and then Harehu Omer. It says, quote, from the book of Ezekiel, and the next word should be higia. No?
Yeah.
Joel?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Keep going, Marshall.
Okay, higia shvua shnishpati le'Avraham she'egal et banav v'lo hayu v'yadam mitzvot litasek bahem kedei sheyiga alu.
Pause.
I'll stop at that point.
Yeah.
Before I do the quote. There had arrived a time to fulfill the oath, that's a shvuah, which I had sworn to Abraham to redeem his children. They, however, possessed no divine commands in which to engage in order that they should merit to be redeemed.
Okay, so we've now read the Rashi in Hebrew. We translated it. Marshall, anyone else? What's Rashi saying so far? How is Rashi's connecting back to a promise to Abraham related to this verse in Ezekiel? Anyone get a sense? Yes, Norm, and then Tova.
I think he's saying the time has arrived that he's going to redeem us from Egypt, but he wants us to have some merit, something that distinguishes us from ordinary idolaters, some mitzvahs for us to complete. And so he says, select this lamb that you're going to slaughter or kid, bring it where you're going to guard it and take care of it, and also circumcise yourselves, so you will have done these two very fundamental mitzvahs, both of which happen to relate to blood.
Okay, so you're right. You're also reading ahead, which is fine, right?
Sorry.
It's okay. Where we are in the comment so far is Rashi saying, this quote from Ezekiel, where Ezekiel is reviewing the whole prehistory of the Jewish people from our infancy with Abraham and the promise that God was going to find us when we were most exposed and most naked and bring us into chuppah. The time has come to do that, but never before, according to this interpretation, have the Jewish people on some weird way been less deserving of redemption than this moment, because we haven't done anything for a couple hundred years. Now, it's not our fault. We are slaves, but Abraham circumcised his son when he was asked, and there's all sorts of ex post facto projection onto Yitzchak and Yaakov, how from they were. But no one thinks that the Israelites who were coming out of Egypt were from. There are other midrashim that suggest that they kept their Hebrew names and they found a way to keep Shabbat, fine. But they haven't really, they haven't put on tefillin in a long time, as it were, right? If you accept the anachronism. So therefore, where we are so far in the verse is, I, God, through Ezekiel's vision, plucked you because it was the time. But I recognize it was time to take you, but you needed some religious clothing and physical clothing. You needed something to be deserving of the very love I'm going to bestow upon you. So, Shneamar
viat erom ve'eryah.
Okay, so now he's quoting the previous verse. So it's up on the screen. The end of the previous verse was, and that moment, you, Israel, Aram, were naked and bare. What it means here in Rashi is spiritually. You weren't cloaked in the garment of Torah because you hadn't had a chance to, right? And so you can see where this is going, and Norm kind of push us in that direction, that I wanted to help you with a Torah garment. Tova and then Rebecca.
Yeah, what I was going to say was this is all still looking back at this verse of the use of lemishmeret, and in his interpretation that this is 4 days of examining for blemish. So in a way, this is like saying, I mean, Norm was specific about what needed to be done, but it's saying you need to examine yourself for your blemishes as a people and ask yourself, do you deserve this redemption?
Interesting. I never connected. I think you might be exactly right. And I never connected that, right? That the seh is almost a metaphor of the type of bikur that Bnei Israel have to go through before redemption. Lovely. Rebecca?
Two things. First of all, about the issue of the Brit Milah, especially someone like Moses, Moshe didn't grow up in a Jewish family.
Yeah.
And perhaps any of the male Jews that somehow survived were not circumcised, even if they wanted to. The other thing was just, it's interesting that the parallel between being slaves and childhood, which I don't quite get, but it's an interesting sort of, this is not how we really raise kids and then marry them off. So.
I think the parallel is less between slavery and childhood and more, if you will, a young maiden left naked and exposed in some dangerous place, and then a prince in shining armor comes, puts a cloak over her, protects her, and then marries her. Right? I think, and so who is the maiden naked, bare, exposed? Us in Egypt. God comes and puts a cloak over on us so that we're not exposed, and then takes us to chuppah. I think that's more of the way that the metaphor is working. Sue, and then I see Diane Larry.
It just is kind of like Naaseh Nishma, which we have over and over again. Naaseh Nishma. You're going to do this, you'll get it. This is part of understanding is doing.
And what's the doing in that sentence for you? What we've been asked to do with the lamb, or
well, the doing is the lamb. The shmirah, to be careful with the lamb. From what Tova said, that doing will bring you to understand your own blemishes.
Got it.
And like that.
Good. Larry, Diane, and then
So I have two thoughts about this. One is, this is kind of like the marshmallow test, which for those who don't know is the test where a child is in a room with a marshmallow and is told that if they can wait, then they'll get 2 marshmallows. So this is maybe some kind of a test of faith, perhaps.
It's not right away,
right?
But the waiting is going to come with a greater payoff.
Right, something like that. So my other thought, and this is from personal experience. So what they've done is they've taken the animal and they've removed it from the flock. And so where is the animal? The animal is probably either in their house or next to their house. And 4 days is enough time to develop a relationship with the animal. And then having to slaughter it. And I say from personal experience because our very first Thanksgiving in Africa, which dates back, 45 years or something, we had a turkey in our yard it was about 4 days, I think, after which Larry slaughtered it. I'm not sure the significance of that, but you develop a relationship with animals, even when they're not dogs or cats, relatively quickly, and certainly in Africa with sheep and goats and cows for sure. So that makes the slaughtering more difficult as well.
It's like the carp in the bathtub. Remember that book, right? Right? Or Zlata the goat, if you remember the Isaac Bashevis Singer story.
Right.
Larry, you did shechita on that turkey? You know shechita? Or you just hit its head against the wall?
It was the best I could do. No, I tried to. I tried to do. I wasn't trained, obviously, but I tried to do one cut with a sharp knife.
Wow. Okay, gobble gobble. All right. Any other hands up before we keep going? Barry?
Just a thought on the medical logistics. I hadn't considered this before, that they were circumcising themselves before running away from Egypt. So they had to have a few days to heal before running.
Yeah, it's interesting. Rashi is going to make a reference in the next line about this circumcision, but without any attempt at trying to find it in the verses, because guess what? It ain't there, right? We have the scene of the nighttime circumcision before Moshe goes back into Egypt, but there's no textual underpinning for the idea that the Israelites were asked to and completed their own circumcision. That's not going to stop Rashi from making the comment he's about to make as a way of pulling together all the different parts of that verse from Ezekiel. Let's keep going with that. I'm going to put the Ezekiel verse back because he's going to keep playing with it. Okay. Where were you, Marshall?
Okay, well, I did Viat Arom the area, and then the meaning of that proof text is V'notan lahem shtei mitzvot. He gave them 2 mitzvot. Dam Pesach v'dam Milah. The mitzvah of sacrificing the lamb, for Paschal lamb, and also the blood of Milah, of circumcision.
Good. So we're getting close to a therefore, and it's similar to the therefore that Norm said. Since you were a Roman area, exposed and barren, I decided to give you merit. What's the way that God gives the Jewish people merit? Mitzvot, commanding them. It's not a burden, or it's a burden that's a blessing. So I gave you 2 blood-based obligations, Dam Pesach v'Dam Milah. And then Rashi says dispositively, as if we just know that, Shemalu b'oto halayla, because they circumcised themselves that night. Now he's about to do a Shene Amar, as it says, but the as it says is not going to go back to any verse from Exodus. It's going to go back to Ezekiel. The logic behind the how do we know that they circumcised themselves is very, if you'll excuse me, Matt, how do we know that Yaakov wore a kippah, right? Because the answer is, well, how could anyone have eaten Korban Pesach without being circumcised? Right? It's circular, right? I mean, but we're told later on in the thing that arel lo yochal bo, that someone who is foreskinned cannot eat of it. So obviously they must have circumcised themselves. The same way we know that Yaakov wore a kippah when he left Beersheba. Hold the thought, Norm. Let's keep reading a little bit.
Okay.
Shene Amar.
Shene Amar, mitbosesed bedomayach. Bedamayach, not bedom. Bedamayach.
Okay.
That is wallowing in your bloods.
Okay, so look at the screen. This is, again, now 2 verses up. So he's going backwards in Ezekiel. He started verse 8, that I came upon you and it was their time of love. Then he makes a reference to verse 7, and you were naked at the time. Now back to verse 6. Va'evor alayach ve'erech, I came upon you and I saw you mitbosesed, wallowing in your blood. He's going to continue the quote later on, but that's where he's up right now. Does anyone find those words at all familiar to you liturgically, ritually?
In the Brit Milah ceremony.
Correct, right? The long blessing that every new rabbi is frightened to lead the first time he or she's out there because it's a lot of chunky words that you haven't said often a lot before. This verse is quoted in the significance of the blood ritual in establishing a covenant. And there's a lot going on here. Bidamayach means what, literally?
In your bloods.
In your bloods, plural. Otherwise, it would be bidamech. So the yud of the bidamayach is plural. Therefore, Rashi says, bishnei
damim.
2 bloods, right?
Bloods,
so Ezekiel is remembering that God remembered that when I plucked you, I saw you wallowing in 2 bloods. So the bloods must have been the blood we're about to learn about on the machkov and the mezuzah, and also the blood of circumcision that obviously you circumcise yourselves with. And then it says,
Ve'omer gam at bedam britech shilachti asirayach mibor.
He goes from Ezekiel to Zechariah, because Rashi can't, again, point to anything in the verses of Exodus that gives any indication that Brit Milah took place. So it goes to another Navi who makes a glancing reference to it. So this is Zechariah chapter 9, and this is the verse. Gam at, also you, bedam britech, with the blood of your bris. I'm going to translate it the way Rashi means it. Shilachti asirayach. It is in that mode that I sent free your prisoners, mibor, from the cistern. What's the cistern? Egypt. Ein mayin bo, without any water in it. It does not necessarily mean that Zechariah meant that they circumcised themselves that night, but it's another verse of the prophets remembering Exodus night with a reference to Dam Brit. And it's enough of a proof text for Rashi. Marshall?
But the words for me also, Mibor Ein Mayim Bo, referred to Joseph.
Yeah, right. So it's
because he was not a seer. He was, in fact, imprisoned by his brothers.
Yeah.
And then he later got imprisoned by
Habor Reik Ein Bo Mayim. Right. You could say even, I took you out from the ordeal that began with that bore, with Joseph being thrown into that. Okay. So let me see if we can pause right there. Okay. So we'll pause right there. Norm, yeah?
Our Torah has 613 mitzvahs. The first 7 apply to all human beings descended from Noah. But other than that, when I think about Bereshis, the only one I can think of is Bris Milah. And this, I believe, is the first time we have another mitzvah being given in Shemos. In the next, there's going to be more than 600 coming in the next 3 2/3 books. But at this point, giving us this mitzvah to kill aseh, is going to be the second mitzvah, particular to the Jewish people. And so God is saying, you've got to catch up. There's this mitzvah you did for a while and you've lost. We're going to catch up. We're going to get a whole bunch of more commandments very soon, or starting very soon. But right now, these are the 2. You didn't do that one when your kids were 8 days old. Do it now.
Great. Yeah, I think it's exactly the spirit of this comment. And there's no punctuation in Rashi, and oftentimes Rashi, as we discussed, gives you the answer without telling you the question and doesn't even tell you when he's finished giving the answer. The way I read the Rashi, he's given his answer to his question because he's about to say something else, which is almost a davar acher. It's almost another point. It's related, but he's no longer really answering the first question, which is why the need for the 4 days. From his perspective, he's given it, and we almost have it implied. There's something else I want to say about this verse. Okay, so let me pause there to see if anyone has any questions on that convoluted walk through Ezekiel and Zechariah. Okay, so Jewish people are now robed in mitzvot, 2 bloody mitzvot, which will make them more deserving, more worthy of this redemption and of their upcoming marriage to God. Okay, now keep going, Marshall. Lefi.
Ulefi shahayu shtufin be'elilim amar lahem. Is it mishchu uchulachem?
Yes.
So mishchu idechem be'elilim uchulachem tzon shel mitzvah.
Okay. So translate ulefi shahayu.
And since they were, I just see the translation here of shtufin as sunk. I don't know the word. No, shetef means like something very fluid.
Lishtof yadayim is to wash hands. So a wash. Think of it as like a wash in. Regular. It's meaning they were used to, but I think the shatuf means they were totally enveloped in.
Right.
Is it from Shetef Dam also?
What's that?
Shetef Dam, a blood clot.
Yeah. Shittafon is a flood. Exactly right.
Right. Okay. Well, since they were enveloped with idolatry, he said to them.
When did he say this to them? Everyone turn ahead to verse 21 in this chapter. So this is not to another book of the Torah, but basically 12 verses later, beginning of the 5th Aliyah Bo. Right. Vayikra Moshe l'chol ziknei Israel. Moses called to all the elders of Israel. Vayomer said to them, Mishchu, pull literally, uchu, and take for yourself. Tzon lemishpacho techem. A sheep for your family. If you wanted to read that phrase, looking for a redundancy, what's redundant about that verse in Hebrew? Yeah, mishchu and chu seem to be the same thing, like pull and take. Well, obviously, you could, if it had said just chu, it would have been fine. So Rashi says, why does God add the mishchu later? Because mishchu literally means to like remove, right? To pull away from. So since they had been shtufim in avodat kochavim, in idolatry, God is going to say to them later on, mishchu uchu. The mishchu is mishchu yidechem.
Okay, mishchu uchu lachem. Lost my part here.
The mishchu is
mishchu yidechem be'elilin.
Pull your hands away from the idolatry with which you become used to because you had no choice but to, and then with your newly purified hands, chu
uchu lachem tzon shel mitzvah, and take unto yourselves a lamb to fulfill the mitzvah.
Right. So he's still dealing with the same ritual, but he's no longer answering the question of the why of 4 days, which is why I think this is in a kind of a subtle davar acher, right? He's now explaining because he's talking about the Israelites not being yet awash in mitzvot. He says this also explains a verse coming up later why you have not just chu, take, but mishchu, uchu, pull and then take.
Or to prove it, another proof text.
But take the microphone.
Could be another proof text to show that this is God's plan to make us worthy by pulling us away from.
Yeah, but it's not another proof text to the question of the 4 days. It's just a proof text for it's. I see it less as a proof text to explain the answer to the question why the 4 days. But rather, now that I've answered the question about the 4 days, that helps us understand a verse coming up in verse 21. Alan?
I'm still a bit confused about this 4-day waiting period and the circumcision, because there was in the attack on Shechem, they said that they waited 3 days until they were going to be at their weakest point, and then they went through the attack. So if it's 3 days to recover from Brit Milah, then how could they do it? Like how could they do it at a
vulnerable time?
At that time? Do you do it on the 4th day before, the 4 days beforehand, or do you do it the night of? Yeah. And what are the consequences?
You're having the chutzpah to ask text to be answerable to other texts, right? So it's a great association, Alan. It's you could go midrashically to why Abraham needed bikur cholim, when the messengers were coming, because he was recovering from his own self-circumcision. I don't think the 4 days in our story here has to do with recovery from Brit Milah, but rather time for this enslaved and idolatrous regular people to just get 2 mitzvot under their belt, just to notch 2 mitzvot. And the mitzvot are Brit Milah and Dama Pesach. And I don't think the time period has to do with recovery, it has to do with actually getting it done, which means you can still ask the question, but it's not the question that Rashi is asking. If that makes sense. Rick, and then Norm, and then we're going to go on.
Hi, 2 things. On verse 21, I just like that Mishchu sounds like Moshe. The text could have used a different verb there, but they picked the one that sounds like Moshe. Anyway, and then in the Rashi on 21,
hey,
what?
You can't do a Rashi on 21.
You led us there.
No, Rashi led us there. Go ahead.
Well, I was just saying it helps explain when we were trying to figure out the lamb for each household or not. So yeah. There he separates the 2 verbs. The mishachu is the one that you can take a sheep from your own, and the kachu is taking buying one from the market, the sheep market. So I just thought that was interesting because we were talking about that last week, a couple of weeks ago.
Got it. So when we get to that verse, we can skip over that Rashi. Consider it done. Thank you, Rick. Norm, and then we'll go on to the next. 2 mics are down on the southern end of the table.
In terms of how could they leave so quickly, they didn't run when they left. they actually move very slowly. It takes them a week before they get even to the Sea of Reeds. And initially, Pharaoh did not gather his charioteers and army to chase them for a while. So they have a few days where they're moving kind of slow. They're stopping at Sukkos and other places, and they are moving pretty slowly. And maybe that's why they moved so slowly.
They were hurting.
Could be.
Yeah. Okay, that concludes Rashi's comment on that part of the verse. Rashi has two more comments on this verse. Let's move to someone else so we get more voices in here. Let's see, Matt, do you want to? Are you at a place where you can read, Matt?
I think so.
Okay, so please read V'shachatu oto.
In the Rashi?
In the Rashi, yeah. It's still on this same verse.
Got it. V'shachatu oto v'gomer. V'chi kulan shochatin.
Question mark?
Shochatin. So, and were they all slaughtered?
Were they all? What's the question?
Slaughtering.
Right. So Rashi is saying v'shachatu oto, and the what in the verse? What's the verb? What's the subject of the verb v'shachatu oto?
The sacrifice.
Kol. No, the subject, not the object.
Oh,
who's doing the slaughtering?
Everybody.
Kol kahal adat Yisrael. Right. The verse seems to say who is doing what Larry tried to do in Mozambique. Everyone is supposed to be slaughtering. So Rashi says, really? Kulan shochatin? Everyone is doing this? Go ahead.
Yeah, did they really though? He says, okay. Ele mikan sheshlucho shel adam kemoto. Rather from this.
From this, when someone says Ela mikan, what's implied is rather we learn from this that, or this is where we learn that.
Yeah. That someone's emissary is as though it is the same person, the same.
Correct. Where in all of your ritual lives do you confront this halachic notion most commonly?
Circumcision.
Okay, I hadn't thought about that. Right, that's how the father gets credit for it because the moral shalach. How about more prosaically?
More prosaically,
We appoint them oil.
Okay, b'lan brit milah. How about weekly, daily or weekly? Say amen. Right. Hamatzi lachem min haaretz. Amen. I imagine most of your Shabbat meals, not all of you are saying hamotzi. Or how many people lead kiddush at your Shabbos dinner? One, right? And then you say amen, and by saying amen, you've kind of retroactively appointed the person who led it to be your shaliach, and you get credit for it, right? How about repetition of the amidah? The whole reason why that exists is because back then there were no books. Not everyone was literate, but everyone had the obligation, right? So the idea is that since you may not be able to say the entire amidah on your own, someone will get up there, say the brachot, you'll say amen, you'll get credit for it. It's clear that developed organically as a principle, and then the rabbis ex post facto said, can we find a hint that this principle was alluded to by the Torah? Yes, right here. Because clearly they're not all sacrificing, but they're all being called sacrificers. How? Because their messenger was doing it for them. It's not the only proof text used in halachic literature, and Rashi doesn't often get into like halachic conversations, but this is his way of saying this is one of the places where the rabbis found an allusion to this notion of shlichut being in the Torah itself. Okay, and yes, brit milah too. I hadn't thought about that. Okay, keep going, Matt. Kahal adat Yisrael.
Okay, kahal adat Yisrael. Kahal ve'eda ve'Yisrael.
And he's basically saying that this three-word phrase seems to be redundantly redundant, right? He doesn't even mention the kol part. It's kol kahal adat Yisrael, but it seems to be each of those words, kahal and edah and Yisrael, could be referring to everyone. So what's the significance of all three? Mikan, he's another. From this we learn.
From this mikan amru. From this we learn. Pischei tzibur nishchatin b'shalosh kitot zo char zo. So public Pesach sacrifices
Mhm.
are slaughtered in 3 parts, one after another.
3 different groups. This is the kitot are.
Oh, it's
groupings.
Kitot, yeah, right.
Okay.
3 different groups do it one after the other. Nichnesa chat rishona ninalud latot ha'azara v'chulei. So the first got to be a group. The first group enters and the doors were shut. Ha'azara, etc. Ha'azara, I don't know.
The Azara is the courtyard outside the place where the sacrifices were done in the temple.
That's before my time, but okay, yeah. So the courtyard. Ki di'ita b'psachim, as it's spelled out in Psachim.
Right. So the phrase that's most interesting that the super commentaries on Rashi most struggle with is pischei tzibur, the sacrifice, the Pesach sacrifices for the public. Most people read it as meaning once the temple stood, when there were these public spectacles of Korban Pesach, this is how it would happen. Some people read Pesach Tzibor for some reason to mean specifically Pesach night, meaning liberation night. But whichever way that is, we're learning, and again, this is an ex post facto, that there would be 3 large groups of people who would come in and do the shechita at one time, because everyone was obligated. And when the first group came in, Ninalu daltot ha'azara, the doors to the outer courtyard were locked until they finished their shechita. And then the second group came in, and we can learn this from the fact that when this mitzvah was given the first time, instead of 1 word being used to describe the Jewish people, it was all 3 words telling you this should happen in 3 large groups. Probably, if you go into the realia of the temple, it's probably pure pragmatics, right? There probably was no day of the year when more people were coming to participate in a sacrifice. And if a lot of people showed up, they can't all fit into the sanctuary at the same time. But once again, we have a hint at it. What's that?
I wonder, so this wouldn't be Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael, 3 groups.
I think that's correct. Everyone's coming for their own individual Korban Pesach as an Israelite.
And there's
divided into groups of 3, A, B, C, right?
Yeah.
First, second, third.
Aleph, Bet, Gimel.
Aleph, Bet, Gimel. Yes, Rachel. Let's get a microphone for Rachel.
In a different course that Norm and I are taking, we just read this in the Mishnah about the 3 groups.
Wow.
And
so you're studying Mishnah Pesachim?
Yeah, it's a course, Hadar, one of the online courses on the various roles of Mishnah, and 3 lessons focused on Pesachim. And they gave a very detailed description of the temple ritual and how the priests and the Leviim were arrayed so that you brought your lamb and one slaughtered, and then they passed the blood from one to another down a line, and the last one would spill the blood on the altar, and just a very elaborate detail.
Yeah.
And one thing that was added in that description was that by the time they came to the 3rd group, the room was no longer full. That the first 2 groups, and this kind of argues against Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael, where Yisrael is the most numerous, that by the time they got to the 3rd group, the room was half empty.
Kind of like Musaf, right, Elon?
Yes.
I think, Matt, you're wearing a beanie, but from this angle, it just looks like you're wearing a very from kippah. I just want you to know that. There it is. It looked like a very yeshivish kippah for a while. Okay. All right, we're not done. We have one more comment of Rashi on this verse, and it's a longish one because he's trying to break down Bein Ha'arbaim. And if you remember, when we read the verse last time, several of the translations of the verse translated it influenced by Rashi's commentary. So if what he says is familiar, it's because we read some of the translations, and it incorporated this commentary. So, Matt, Bein Harabayim.
Bein Harabayim mishesh sha'ot uma'ala karui bein Harabayim.
Okay, what does that mean?
From the 6th hour and above or beyond is called Bein Harabayim.
What does the 6th hour mean halachically?
Daylight was divided into 12 equal spaces, I think.
Correct.
And so 6 would be like noon, I guess.
Right. On a day, if it ever happens, where sunrise would be 6 a.m. and sunset would be 6 p.m., then the 6th hour would be noon. But of course, sometimes sunrise is at 4:59 and sunset is 8:15, right? So it's Sheish Sha'ot is 6 halachic hours a day, halfway through that day's daylight, right?
Literally midday. All right.
Literally midday. By the way, where the 6 hours becomes most significant in Jewish practice is when mincha can begin. Mincha cannot begin earlier than 6.5 halachic hours of the day, right? That's called mincha gedola, right? And it's understood that you we do mincha Beth Am at the least worthy time to do mincha, when the window is about to close. The idea is that you should do mincha when the window opens, right? Zrizin makdimin limitzvah, which is why the people are very committed to a Vatican dawn minyan. Just parentheses, many of you know that I'm in Avelut and I'm saying Kaddish 3 times a day, which has thrown a real curve into my Sunday biking, because we usually would be out biking by 6:15 or 6:30 in the morning, and Beth Am's minyan is 8 o'clock. So there's a wonderful website called Godaven, which tells you wherever you are in the world, it tells you where the closest minyan is, divided by Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Dora Mizracha. So I found all the Vatican day sunrise minyanim in the Pico area, and the one I've been going to is at the Link Kolel on the south side of Pico. So their minyan changes every day, and when you go there, every day there's posted, this is the earliest time you could put on the talit, and this is the earliest time we can get to the brachot, and this is the earliest time we get to the shema, and they time it so that you begin to say the amidah at the second that is the earliest halachic time, because they're trying to rush to do a minyan. And it's also helpful for getting out into the bike path later. So this last week, like minyan began at 6:18, and you could get to the amidah at 6:28 or something like that. Okay, so 6.5 daylight hours is when mincha should begin. 6 hours in this verse basically means halfway through the day. And just think about it. What's happening once you've hit noon celestially? Right. It's waning, right? The sunlight is waning. It's a way of saying it's the same. It's like the daily solstice or equinox, right? You've hit the equinox. And so now the next half of the thing is a waning. Okay. Yes. Norm?
I know some people who go to mincha after lunch.
As it turns out, Pesach is usually very close to when we have actual 12-hour days.
Yeah.
And if we weren't using daylight savings time, that would typically be about 6 to 6.
Yeah.
But completely aside from that, an hour for these purposes always is...
Get the microphone closer.
Always is 1/12 of the daylight hours, or 1/12 of the nighttime hours.
Correct.
And so whether the day is short or long or exactly 12 hours, halfway through the daylight hours is the 6th hour.
Correct.
Which corresponds to when the sun is at the top of the sky.
Correct. Which sometimes is noon and sometimes is not, the way we think of time. Okay, so he says, Rashi says, Bein Harabayim means begins. What's that, Matt?
Did you want me to read or what?
Yeah, hold on one second. Marshall, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a public service announcement relative to what Rachel was saying, that I also am participating in the Hadar Project Zug.
Put microphone towards you, not away from you.
Okay, so as a public service announcement, I also am participating in the Project Zug of Hadar. And there's a great course in Mishnah in context, which also dealt with how the laws of damages are dealt with in Roman law too, in the concept of boshet. And the course itself was for 10 weeks, cost $75. The next session will be starting in March, and you can sign up now. And also the public service for our shul, that tomorrow night Rabbi David Kasher will be teaching in the Beit Midrash. And if you haven't had a chance to study with him, you really give yourself a real treat if you can come to hear him teach and participate in Chavruta learning.
Amen. Thank you, Marshall. Okay, so from 6 hours on is considered Bein Harabayim, and now Rashi explains why he thinks that phrase means that. Sheh?
Okay, Shehashemesh noteh levet mevo'o la'arev. So that the sun inclines towards the house of its arrival at evening.
Right. It's the day at which the sun has reached its apex and is now it's in its descent. We discussed last week, does Erev mean Erev because it means mixture? Or is Sioni Zevit right that it means a descent? And interesting, Rashi is using the verb la'arov as if it means a descent, a darkening, not a mixing. So Rashi agrees with that etymology. Lashon
ben arbayim nireh be'einei otan sha'ot sheben arivat hayom la'arivat halayla.
So he's now going to try to pull the meaning out of the words. What does between the Aravim mean? Not between the Arabs. That's the state of Israel. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, when I went to lease an apartment once a long time ago, they told me I had to bring an Aravi, and that's a guarantor.
Yes.
But I thought it meant an Arab. Okay.
Yes.
So the language of Bein Ha'aravim is seen.
Seems to me near Eb Einai. It seems
it seems to me to be the same hours that are between the Ariva of the Yom and the Ariva of the Laila.
So if he's defined Areva here as a waning, okay, then he thinks Bein Ha'arbayim is between when the day begins to wane. When does the day begin to wane? Right? And then when does the problem here is that he's reading Arevat Hayom as the waning of the day, but he's not reading Arevat Halayla as the waning of the night, because the waning of the night is not at dusk. It's halfway through nighttime. So I think he's more reading Arevat as the darkening. Between the darkening of the day, the darkening of the day begins at noon. The darkening of the night is dusk, right? Like as you're getting closer and closer into darkness. It doesn't exactly work scientifically. But Arevat Hayom,
Arevat Hayom b'tchilat
Sheva.
Okay. Arevat Hayom b'tchilat Sheva sha'ot ki yinatu tzlilei erev. So the evenings waning at the beginning of the 7th hour.
Right. So when does the evening of the day, evening as almost a verb, as a gerund, happen? When does the darkening or the descending of the day happen? It begins at the beginning of the 7th hour, which is at the end of 6 hours. And he has this quote from Jeremiah, which I forgot to pull up. So let me pull it up quickly. 1 second. What is it? Jeremiah 6:4?
You say what
that is?
Isaiah.
Yeshayahu, it says here.
Yeshayahu what?
Kaf Daled. Kaf Daled.
Silverman has 11, 24:11.
Thank you.
No, but that's a different. That's the next one that he's going to make reference to. First, he's got Jeremiah 6:4. Hold on a second.
6.
My Sefaria doesn't give a cite for that. Doesn't give a quotation.
I think Rashi. So now he said, do you have the phrase mi chiyinatu tzilei arev? Do you have that? Oh.
Yes, I think so.
You don't have that in there. Okay. So there must be versions of Rashi that include and exclude. I'm going to share the screen.
Yeah, mine says Yinatu tzilei arev.
Okay. So there's a reference to this verse from Jeremiah. Kadshu ha'aleha milchama. It's translated as prepare for. It's interesting we use the word kodesh, but make an exception or focus on the war. Kumu v'na'aleh b'tzarayim. We're going to get up and attack at noon. Oranu kifana hayom, but once it's terrible for us once the day is beginning to turn, it's getting darker. Ki yinatu, because then the tzilalei arev, west sail?
Sail, shade.
Shadows, right? The shadows of the day are tending, meaning think the way shadows work. The shadows are moving from this side, it's like a sundial, to that side. So once the shadows are turning, then you have begun the evening of the day. So that's how he defines Arevat Hayom. And how does he help us Arevat Alayla?
Okay. Arevat Alayla, b'tchilat halayla, at the beginning of the night.
So he's using Arevat different in each ways. It's not the beginning, because Arevat Hayom is not the beginning of the day. So you almost have to, you almost can't say this in English because it only works in Hebrew, that it's the evening of the day and the evening of the night.
Mm-hmm. The evening of the day, watch a song. Watch the children play.
Can't hear. I can't hear.
We've been thinking about it.
All right, but no one can hear you on Zoom. No crosstalk on Zoom. Okay, so keep going.
Okay, all right. Erev Lashon Neshef V'choshech.
So now this is a very Rashi thing. He's giving this whole explanation, and now he's telling you what he thinks the root means, such that everything he's set up until now makes sense. It would have been helpful, Rashi, to start with that, right? So he says Erev has to do with Neshef and Choshech. If you don't know the word Neshef, you do know the word Choshech.
It's darkness, and Neshef means breath, or it could be in a wind or something, or soul, or I think it means like the evening breeze, and as it gets dark.
Right. And now he brings us to the proof text from Isaiah.
Okay. Kimo arva kol simcha.
Okay. So this is up on the screen. 24. 24:12. Yeah. Okay.
Sun is set on all. Yeah.
Svacha al hayayin. A cry, a weeping comes up over the wine, bachutzot, in the courtyards. Arva kol simcha, all of the joy has arrived. So it can't mean nixing here. It can't mean beginning here. It can't mean ending. It means a darkening. Like according to Rashi, there's a proof text that the root ayin reish bet can mean the ending of something. Simcha had waxed, now simcha has waned, right? Or actually, that wouldn't work. Simcha had been full of light, and now it's darkening. So the darkening of the day begins at noon, and the deepening darkening of the night begins at dusk. Okay, so that's a long way of his saying that he doesn't think Bein Ha'arbayim means what it came to mean in Jewish vernacular later on. I don't know if in Rashi's time, when people in the yeshiva referred to Bein Ha'arbayim, they mean what we mean now, which is not between noon and dusk, but dusk. I just don't know. I don't remember if Bein Ha'arbayim itself exists as a phrase denoting that time in the Talmud. It may be later. Okay, comments, questions? Yes, Rebecca.
So I've been thinking about this a little bit since last week when I realized that it's not a term that is, well known, because my mind immediately went to dusk. And so I'm going to suggest something very, a little bit revolutionary.
Woo!
Yeah, I know.
It's getting warm in here.
Yeah. Looking at the sentence as a whole, I see a time, which is the 14th day of the month.
Uh-huh.
There's an action, which is the slaughtering. There's the people that slaughter. There's the thing that gets slaughtered, but there's no spot where we slaughter it. And so I'm wondering if anyone has ever interpreted this as
where.
And my thought was going to, by a river, there's, I should have looked up if the word arava, alvot hanachal, all that somehow is sort of mentioned in some context of this, but I didn't. Anyway, that was my. I've been thinking about it.
Nice. I mean that's how scholarship happens. One is not satisfied with an answer given, there might be another explanation. I've never come across that. That doesn't mean that's not worth exploring. And ayin resh beit is one of the most pluripotent roots in the Hebrew language. It means lots of different things, like arvei nachal, arbot nachal, right? So maybe that is the meaning here, right? We don't know. Marshall.
That when Israel left Egypt, along with them came an Erev.
Correct.
A mixed multitude.
Right. So there, Erev seems to be mixture, and arov means to mix, which is why until I heard that lecture by Tzioni Zevet, I always thought that's why Erev meant Erev. It's probably wrong. It's probably a different notion. It's probably the Erev that Rashi is referring to, the darkening. Yeah. Okay. Shkarach, Matt, let's at least read the next verse. We got through all the Rashis on verse 6. There were a lot of them. It took us 2 weeks to just do a verse. Carol, do you want to read verse 7?
Okay, are you hearing me okay?
Yeah.
All right. V'lakhu min hadam, v'natnu al shtei hamezuzot, ve'al hamashkof, al habatim, asher yochlu oto bahem.
Okay.
And you will take of the blood.
Literally they, the lakhu is they.
Okay, they will take of the blood, and they will place it, I guess, on the 2 doorposts. I assume. Zot.
In biblical Hebrew, natnu can be both to give and also to place. Yeah.
So to place it on the 2 doorposts and on the mashkof, which I don't know what that is.
Well, it's the top of the chet. So the 2 doorposts
and the top.
And this, okay. Well, Rashi will get to an explanation as to why mashkof might mean that, and he may or may not be correct etymologically.
Al habatim. Okay, on the houses, in which you were eating it,
or will eat it.
Will eat it.
Good. So this is the moment where the Israelite people are told of the ritual that every kid grows up knowing was central to the 10th plague, that slaughter happens, you take the blood and you dab it on one side of the door, the other side of the door, right? Notice the mezuzah here does not mean an object, but just describing the vertical part of the door. We'll get into that. And also on the mashkof. And which houses? On those houses in which they will eat them. Okay, and I'm emphasizing that because Rashi is going to focus on that descriptor of the houses. Because had it just been the al hamashkov al habatim period, we would have gotten the point, right? So once again, if we're searching for extraneous words to derive meaning, asher yochlu oto bahem doesn't seem to be necessary to be there. Okay. Any comments or questions on the verse itself before we close up, and we'll look at the Rashis next time? Many, Tova? Oh.
No, I just think we need to do comments when we come back to.
Yes, when we start next week, we can also do comments. But anything that you want to say now that the verse is out there? Microphone.
Yeah.
Give it the microphone. What's your question?
No, it's not. No.
Not on.
Mashkof and mishkefet and mishkafayim it all has to do with right, sight.
Yeah, maybe, right? So mashkof is structurally created from shin kuf pei, and the root that most of us think of as shin kuf pei is to view, to gaze, mishkafayim, hashkifa mimon konchecha, right? Which may or may not be what it means here. And we'll look at Rashi's etymology, and then we'll look next week at BDB's etymology, which do not necessarily agree. Tova? Hashkafa, outlook, right.
Is there anything unusual about, it sounds unusual, but from a biblical meaning sense, Lakachu min hadam v'natnu. That just to my ear sounds odd, but.
As opposed to samu?
Something like that, yeah.
Biblically, it just makes sense.
It just makes sense.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of other references that it would come that you would understand. Isn't V'natnu?
Yeah.
In which in Parshat Tzav or something, or Shmini?
Yeah. It isn't actually.
Wait, Stevie.
If you count the words, it will not be the middle word. But traditionally, the middle word of the Torah is not new, which is palindrome.
Right, and it means there they will place, not they will give as a gift. Yeah. God, I was thinking of another example that is obvious, but I can't come up with that. Barry, last comment, then we'll call it a day.
Just a question. We'll probably answer it next week. But with what will you take the blood?
Very good.
And put on the door. What are you going to put it on the doorpost?
Yeah, good. So when we start next week, Carol, you're on for the Rashi if you're up for it. Have a good day, everyone. Have a good week. Early Shabbat Shalom. Happy Parshat Yitro.
You've been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am, Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.